title of my talk is IDS is Dead, Long Live IDS. My name's Eric Arnoth. I've been in the industry for about 16 years now. For most of those years, I've been doing network intrusion detection, among other things, and network security, so I have a lot of experience. And I've seen a lot of things that I want to share with everyone to kind of give a picture of what I think is going on in the industry right now and where we need to go as defenders. For starters, we have a problem, right? And everyone, I think, in this room kind of knows this pretty well, that the attackers have the advantage. It's always kind of been this case, right? It's just that it's gotten a lot worse lately, and it keeps getting worse with no end in sight. Those of us who work in this industry, that's not such a bad thing, but we do want to make it better, right? We do want to close the door and make sure that the attackers can't get in as much as they could. They have been for a long time now. And you just have to look at what's going on out there in the world to see what I'm talking about. The media is full of accounts of companies that are left and right, major companies getting compromised in massive ways. Massive data leakage is of epic proportions that 10 years ago would have been inconceivable. That would have been shocking. But it's becoming business as usual, and we're kind of getting numb to it. So it's important to take a step back and figure out why did it get this bad, and what can we do to fix it. And the answer to a lot of it is that the defenses we've relied upon, like intrusion detection, are failing us in a big way, and we need to rethink how we're doing things. And at the end of the day, those defenses that we've lived with at the perimeter for years are pretty well ineffective. They don't provide as much value as they used to. When I started in the field back in the late 90s, and their value keeps diminishing over time. And at the end of the day, blacklisting as a defensive technology is dying if it's not dead already. Many of us who've been in the field for a while already kind of know that blacklisting isn't very good at defending us, but unfortunately that is the nature of intrusion-based systems. It's a blacklisting system. And I'm going to go into a lot of the technical details as to why it's been failing us and what we can maybe do to deal with it. And in case you don't believe me, this website up here, information is beautiful.net, that URL, the slides will be available and all that. They produced a nice infographic that shows the compromises over time. And as you notice here, 2006, 2007, as the dates roll by, a lot of white space between all the bubbles that depict the compromises that have happened that were public and pushed out there. The compromises just keep getting bigger, and there's less white space between the compromises, and the numbers keep getting bigger. You see some names that you might recognize, like JP Morgan Chase and Anthem and eBay and Target, and we probably all recognize these names from what's been in the media. And, as you saw from that thing scrolling by, it just got bigger and bigger, and there's no end in sight. So why is that? How did this happen? So what happened was about 7 or 8 years ago, the threat landscape changed in a really, really bad way. 20 years ago, when I first, I didn't quite start 20 years ago, but 20 years ago, in the era in which I started this business, it was a very different threat landscape. We were dealing with a lot of server-side vulnerabilities. When I started to install my first intrusion detection system for the big corporation that I worked for, the drill was always, okay, we got our services out on the internet. We're worried about protecting our web servers, our DNS service, and all that good stuff. And sooner or later, some O-Day announcement was going to drop on full disclosure or bug track or what have you, and everyone was going to freak out with their hair on fire because, oh my God, they can break into our web server and they can completely compromise our systems. So we'd run around, we'd try and get patches in, and before we could get the patches in, because patches take a long time, we had to go and install in signatures on our intrusion detection systems, because that was much easier than installing the patches, which took time and effort to patch and test and roll out and all that stuff. And so we'd go through the process of getting intrusion detection signatures out there, we'd catch some things as they tried to break in, get the patches in, close the holes, and everything was good. And of course, because it was all server-side, where the web server, the DNS server was what was vulnerable, we could take those assets, put them in a DMZ, safely contain them, so that if there was a breach, or maybe when there was a breach, that would be contained to that area. We wouldn't have to worry about the environment because we had firewalls on the inside protecting us. That was the theory. But about 8 or 9 years ago, something changed. Back then, I was still doing intrusion detection systems, and we had just installed some latest, greatest vendor. The name doesn't matter. They all have this problem. And around that time, one of the guys I was working with was in charge of threat intelligence. He was kind of watching the vulnerabilities as they rolled out, and keeping an eye on things, and making sure the company was responding appropriately. And he started asking me, "Hey, Eric, what about this vulnerability in Word and in Adobe?" That's a good question. We go check with my vendor. Ask the vendor, "Hey, we've got these great signatures for all these server-side vulnerabilities. That's fantastic. What about this one over here for Office and for the browser?" Let me get back to it. And so we went through a couple more cycles of that, and very quickly it became apparent that they didn't have a good answer. And we're going to explain why here in a minute. And so attackers did start shifting to using those client-side attacks, which was a sea change, a major seismic shift from what they had been doing up until that time. So if we look and explore as to why they did it, we'll see what has brought us to where we are today. So why did the attackers start using client-side? There's a number of reasons. For first off, the programs that are written, these are processing large pieces of data, large documents. Anyone ever look at a Word document lately? It's like how many megabytes in size, right? The requests going to a web server can be measured in bytes or kilobytes. The files that are being processed by Word and Adobe and the rest of it, they easily number in the megabytes or in the tens of megabytes or even in the hundreds of megabytes. So we're dealing with a massively more complex data structure. And what that translates into is attack surface. Because at the end of the day, the vulnerabilities that we face every day in our programs are a function of lines of code. So I'm going to point out a study from Mudge, or not a study, but a metric cited by Mudge from his keynote in 2011, Black Hat, that pointed out that, he quoted an IBM statistic that said for every 1,000 lines of code, there's 1 to 5 bugs. That's what IBM had figured out through some study they did. So every vulnerability is going to be a bug. Not every bug is going to be a vulnerability, and not every vulnerability will be exploitable. But at the end of the day, when you're dealing with a program like Microsoft Office, which according to Microsoft's own blog has between 25 million and 50 million lines of code. So if we measure attack surface and the number of bugs in a program, and if we're measuring the programs by the rough metric of 1 to 5 bugs for every 1,000 lines of code, it doesn't really take a lot of math to figure out that there's a massive amount of potential bugs that could be in that program. And so it's not just Office, right? It's the browsers. It is the Adobe readers. It is QuickTime. It is iTunes. It is your font libraries. It is your graphics libraries. Pretty much any code that processes data that you get from the internet is now a potential target. And so the other wrinkle to this, which is a really sweet one for the attackers, is we have all our assets like web servers and DNS servers locked up in DMZs. That's great. Where do our desktops sit? They sit inside the WAN, right? Deep inside, no firewall protection between them and any other asset in the corporation or in the organization you're protecting. All the servers are wide open because at the end of the day, internal network security is really, it's hard to do, segmented network security. Maybe some organizations can manage it, but as soon as you start scaling beyond a minimal size, it becomes cost ineffective to deploy a significant amount of network security. And as it turns out, we also have the problem that these programs are often run by non-IT people. So of course that brings us to the social engineering aspect of it. So we can very quickly have, of course, the idea of a malicious Word file and so forth. But at the end of the day, between the buffer overflows and so forth that we have in these programs, we are dealing with a very different landscape. Because as soon as the adversary compromises the desktop inside of your environment, they have the run-of-the-mill. There is nothing to stop them from moving laterally and moving on and doing other things. And that has changed the way attackers behave, which I'll also explore a little bit further on in my talk up ahead. So, the client-side programs introduce the problem of a massive attack surface. They make it easy for an adversary to break into a system because there's just so many potential bugs. And of course, these programs constantly change over time, right? So you have Office coming out with constant revisions. Firefox is up to version 40-something by now, right? They keep revving all the time. Same thing with all the other browsers. But this also has introduced a problem with our defenses that we relied upon 10 years ago, the network intrusion detection system. So if you go back to what I was saying about the old model where you had to worry about your web server having the buffer overflow and all that good stuff, and you release your IDS signatures when the vulnerability is published and the exploit is known, you had the idea that you could stop it. And it worked reasonably well for what we had at the time. But the problem is that doesn't translate into the client side. It simply breaks down and it fails completely. So, just to remind, just to kind of give a refresher there, our network intrusion detection system, you're sniffing packets on the wire. Maybe you're in line, maybe you're an intrusion prevention system. But you got packets coming through in real time, and you have to process those packets in real time in order to understand what's being said and what's being done, and whether an attack might be inside of that or not. that is a lot of processing power that you have to apply in order to determine whether or not the traffic is hostile or not. Because again, we're blacklisting, right? We're assuming everything is good unless we can look at something and compare it to our list of 10,000 signatures, let's say, of known bad. So we have to do a lot of processing to do that. I'll show some real-world examples in a few slides. But at the end of the day, that was always kind of a rough arms race where we had signatures, vulnerabilities would come out, IDS guys would write the signatures, and on top of that, there were some evasion methodologies that bad guys could use in order to avoid the IDS signatures. But on the client side, that model just breaks down at the end of the day. So server-side attacks are relatively simple by comparison to client-side. But with the client-side programs, as I mentioned, they're dealing with massive amounts of data, megabytes, tens of megabytes, and so forth. And inside those files is an incredible level of complexity that goes well beyond anything on the server side. Server side is usually a request, an answer, back and forth, well-defined protocols. Things are very clear-cut. On the client side, it gets very muddy very fast. And I'll give you some examples in a couple slides to talk about that. So at the end of the day, the final result of that is that the client-side attack methodology makes DTAC and inspection technologies fairly well useless, which is what we've been depending on so long. So just as an example, we have here a signature from Snork. Everyone loves Snork. It's a fantastic product. I've used it for years. It's still great at what it does. But if we take a look at this example, okay, you can't see my cursor here. So if you look at the signature, there's a content colon Etsy shadow. So this is a very, very simple signature. We're looking for the words Etsy shadow to see if someone's trying to access the encrypted shadow file where all our passwords live on a Unix device. Obviously, we shouldn't see that in a normal environment unless it's some kind of scanner or something like that. So pretty easy. There are some evasion methods that can be applied to that. The attacker could try and change some of the the casing, or it could try and inject some characters, and the IDS has to handle all that in order to make sure that it can translate back to what the web server will receive ultimately to know if this was a bad signature or not. There we go. For the next one, this is a much more complex signature, but it's still kind of to the point. In this case, this is a signature to detect MS-0867, which is a buffer overflow that Microsoft had as a vulnerability in its Windows products back in 2008. For those who don't remember this one, it was kind of one of the nasties of the nasty. It was in the Windows Server Service. So this was a vulnerability for every version of Windows. Vista, XP, it was 2K3, the whole lot of it, all the service packs at that time. And it was a service that was on by default on every Microsoft Windows. It was kind of the perfect storm. It gave system-level access uncompromised. It was extremely reliable as a buffer overflow. And it was, again, on every version of Windows, so very nasty. Now, as complex as this signature is, what it does demonstrate is how well you could actually construct signatures to detect buffer overflows in server-side. So you got to realize that the Microsoft protocols are binary in nature, right? So this is the kind of protocol where the fourth bit gets read and the number of bytes in there tells you how many characters are going to be in the next several bytes. It's a remote procedure call protocol. So it's about one Windows box talking to another Windows box and saying, okay, I want to use this function on you to, say, access a file share or to access a printer service that you have. And so one computer is going to another computer and it's basically making function calls on that computer. The MS-0867 vulnerability was in the server service in the net path canonicalized function call of that service. And it was basically a bounds checking problem where one of the arguments to that function was only supposed to have so many characters, but the buffer overflow allowed it to have so many more characters, and therefore, classic buffer overflow scenario, you could lay in your hostile code and you could compromise the machine. This signature goes through the arduous process of walking through every bit and byte that's relevant to determine, is the function call netpath canonicalized being called, number one, and number two, if it is, what's the size of the argument that is being presented to that function call? So by doing this, this is called detecting against the vulnerability rather than the exploit. And so you're looking to see, is the vulnerable service being accessed, and is it being accessed in a way that would indicate a successful compromise. All well and good. So here's a packet capture to show a successful attack. Using Metasploit, you can easily reproduce this yourself. It has a wonderful bit of a payload and an exploit in order to compromise MSO867. You can do the packet capture on the wire yourself, and that's fantastic. So you can easily reproduce this and see if Snork can detect it or any other IDS that you're running. It really doesn't matter. All the vendors should be able to catch this in spite of even some evasions that they have. And you'll notice actually that the other thing is you walk through a number of packets. There's 358 packets on this count, if you see. Some of those packets are actually superfluous stuff, but if you look down at the actual trace between three-way handshake to the vulnerable service and then the RPC calls that you need to get down to the vulnerable function and then exploit that function, you're talking about 20 packets. So the amount of data that the IDS has to look at in order to get from A to B to say, aha, here's something vulnerable being exploited, very small and measurable. Now, if we contrast that to client-side signatures, we see a very different story very quickly. So the easiest of the easy for the server side was just, like an 8 to 10 byte match, in the data set. And then the more complicated one for MSO867 was much more complicated, but it was still something you could walk through and get your head around if you just took the time to walk through all that. In this case, however, the first two signatures I picked a look at, we can't see. In spite of most of Snork's signatures being open source and available as text, they have a growing body of signatures that are compiled as libraries. There's a number of reasons that they do this. One is complexity. Well, actually, the first one I'm going to just lay out there is legal reasons. Microsoft Active Partner Program, other vendors have similar programs where they give vulnerability information to vendors in advance so that they can get their signatures ready and be prepared when the announcement's made. And then at the end of the day, but they're not allowed to disclose any details. So Snork has, all the vendors that do this have to not share the details of the vulnerability. But Snork also does this in order to deal with complexity levels that exceed the Snork rules language. So if anyone's out there familiar with the Snork rules language, you'll know it's pretty flexible. You can do a lot with it. There's a lot of power. But when they're trying to detect client-side vulnerabilities, that power just isn't enough. They had to write raw C to do some tricks that go well above and beyond what the Snork rules engine allows them to do. But if we take a look at a different signature here, in this case it's targeting CVE 2010-1297. It happens to be some buffer overflow in an Adobe Reader product, I believe. What we have here is it's looking for a simple simple string match. So it's looking for, you jump all the way down, it's looking for a PDF file that Snork would pull out with its preprocessors, and it's looking for content of either LOLOL or Hex5C or 056SWF. And basically that's what it wants to see. So I went back into Metasploit like I did with the MSO867, that's preloaded there. And I gave a look to see what happens if I create a CVE 2010-1297 exploit buffer, PDF buffer overflow. It turns out that the pattern LOLOL does not exist in that document. You just take the raw document and do a search for that string. Very interesting. Another interesting little bit is that on the Snork.org website, they claim there are no false negatives for this. Okay, well, moving on from that. If we look at the Metasploit exploit code, and if we start taking apart how this exploit is built, you'll quickly start to see why client-side is killer for IDS, signature-based IDS. So we have here the exploit function call from the Ruby module in Metasploit that builds the 2010-1297 exploit. And what we see here are some key function calls. So at the very first function call below the exploit, we have here make SWF, so it's making a Swift file that's going to be used in the exploit. We see the next function call is make.js, which is JavaScript, so it's going to make some JavaScript. And if you'll note, the argument for make.js is a payload that is already encoded related to us by the variable name being used. And then the PDF, make PDF function call is used, where the output of the make.js function call is taken as an input. The Swift data that was created from the make Swift function call is used as an input, and then a resulting PDF is given, which is then the PDF that has the exploit embedded in it. So if we go down and start looking at the function calls used to build this exploit, starting with make.js, we'll immediately start to see where some of the problems are. So it takes the encoded payload at the top there, And it's going to take some, it's going to basically escape some of the characters so that it can do some stuff with it. And if you look down at the next block of code here from JS equals, what you're looking at here is the exploit that Metasploit is building is putting the JavaScript in the PDF file that carries the exploit. I'm going to go through it in just a little bit more detail, but the long story short here with this JavaScript is Metasploit is giving the JavaScript the disassembled buffer overflow to reassemble. So it's basically giving the Adobe Reader all the tools it needs to build the exploit by itself, reassemble it into a functional attack method, and then it will execute it on itself. So it's basically giving it parts to a gun and the bullets. It's telling it how to build the gun and load the bullets, telling it how to point the gun to its own head and pull the trigger. That's basically what we're doing here. So we have a process where we go through and we take the shell code of the buffer overflow, we do some tricks with it to make it ASCII. We take the NOP sled of the buffer overflow, we encode that some so that we can put that into JavaScript. We go ahead and we take the, we put all that together with the NOP code and the shell code, and then we put all that together with some further obfuscation. Where basically, it's not an easy assembly, right? There's some tricks here that are going on with the JavaScript to make it non-obvious without actually sitting down with the JavaScript engine, and just executing the JavaScript code that the author arbitrarily chose as his methodology to give the vulnerable program a disassembled exploit to reassemble on its own time. So that's not enough, right? That was the first function call, the make.js function call. If we go on to the make.pdf call, we see that it's taking that output of the JavaScript function call. We see that it's taking the Swift file that was resulting of the make Swift, which is just a plain old Swift file for the exploit. And we go through another set of steps here where we're really getting into some further obfuscation here. So right down below so we have make PDF arguments, we have PDF length, xref, and then we have down below where we are, through some Ruby stuff, taking in nobfu, N-O-B-F-U function call, and we're giving it some arguments that are basically PDF structure elements that declare the JavaScript that is upcoming. So we built the JavaScript in the last function call. Now we're building the PDF calls that say, hey, you've got some JavaScript coming, and then here's the JavaScript ending. So we're taking those strings as input to the nobfu function call. And if we take a look at the nobfu function call, we go through it, and basically what this function is doing is iterating through every character in that string, and it is arbitrarily deciding, do I make this uppercase or do I make this a lowercase? Do I change it in some other way into a unpacked binary? So there's a little PDF article that is referenced in the header of the function call there. You can see the Dieter Stevens blog post, and what it reads there is, okay, better read over here. In this post, I show how basic features of the PDF language can be used to generate polymorphic variants of malicious PDF documents. If you go to PDF Parser, write signatures for antivirus or IDS, or analyze malicious PDF documents, you should be aware of these features. And then he goes on to say, while browsing through the official PDF documentation, I took particular interest in the rules to express selections. There are many ways to write the same token, offering opportunities to evade known pattern recognition systems like AV and IDS. So if you take a look at the input strings, we have here type, action, S, JavaScript, JS, the IRF component of it, and then some greater than symbols to close out the character. This is what comes out in the resulting file. And you'll notice it looks absolutely nothing like what it came as. And so you have here the only remnant that happened to be not encoded. Again, it was randomly choosing which characters it's going to encode. And then again, it happens with this other part of PDF structure that wraps around the JavaScript. And if that's not enough, what also further happens is there's going to be some compression of the JavaScript itself, which then results in all this stuff, which is just a compressed file that is a compressed component of the data that is put inside of that data stream. So in order for an IDS system that's reading on the wire in real time to deal with this PDF, it needs to, one, parse the entire PDF structure, recognize through the doubling of all the encodings of the PDF headers themselves that, okay, there's JavaScript in here, decompress the JavaScript, go through the whole JavaScript engine routines to figure out what that arbitrary JavaScript was telling it to do, and then recognize that all that, the exploit that was given to it was in fact an exploit. So that means it needs to understand the Adobe structure enough to say that whatever that exploit was happening to do, it was something that would result in a buffer overflow and compromise the readme. Easy, right? No problem. Not so much. So I think I made a good case that signature-based IDS cannot handle this. Yes? No? Okay, so nodding evidence. Good. So on the other side, well, antivirus is safe, right? Everyone's confident that they're running antivirus and you're safe, right? Okay, I'm seeing some smiles and some shaking hands. Good. So yeah, no, it's not going to help you at all. Antivirus suffers from the same problems, and they're worse actually. So let's break it down real quick. All my information here came from a couple of talks. I want to give a shout out to them real fast. The 2013 BSides LV talk, Malware Automation by Christopher Ellison. Outstanding talk. Go to that URL. He goes into this in glorious detail. And then, well, the other one I'll get to in a minute. But the long story short of his talk, so this is spoiler alert, apologies. But the adversaries, the bad guys, have got us hands down on the antivirus side because when you get down to it, and I'll break it down, but when you get down to it, the bad guys have learned how to automate evasion of our defenses, and we are stuck in a process of manual defense against that automation. So every time we pit man against machine, we're going to lose, right? We can't move as fast as the automation. So what are they automating? They are automating they take a piece of malware that they want to hide, and they're going to pack it. They're going to use polymorphism. They're going to encrypt it. They're going to bind it to legitimate executables. There are segments of an underground economy that will sell their services to botnet operators and say, give me your code, give me a big chunk of cash. I've got all the network intrusion detection systems in my rack. I got all the antivirus in my rack, just like VirusTotal. I'm going to run through them all. I'm going to do all these things to armor up your malware for you until nobody sees it. Then I'm going to give it back to you. You can do your operation. And if they see it again, come back to me with more money. I'll do it again. It's no problem. I just push a button. It's all automatic. And they can just go go for days like this with no problem. Meanwhile, on the defensive side, what do we have to do? McAfee. So one of the antivirus vendors, doesn't matter who, sees, finds something in the wild. What do they have to do? Take it apart. Well, they have to take the sample. They have to reverse engineer it. It's a manual, intensive process. They have to figure out how it works. They have to figure out what signature they can write against it. It can take hours. It can take days. It can take weeks. Bad guys, they've got us all automated down to push button. So they've got us beat hands down. Antivirus is not going to save us. The only part of good news in this is that we, as defenders, have got a similar offensive capability now to whatever the bad guys have in the Veil framework, which was released in ShmooCon 2014, and that talk is up, available on the web as well. And I'm sorry, that's the slides. The project is open source and widely available, and it integrates nicely with Metasploit. So now we can use offensive technology that shows us how poorly the defensive antivirus can behave, and we can do the same thing they can. Hopefully this challenges the antivirus vendors to do better. Whether or not it's possible, I don't know. I don't know that it is. Because at the end of the day, if you look at evasion in IDS, if you look at evasion in antivirus, it's really hard to beat. We can kind of beat them on network intrusion detection server side. We can't beat them on client side. The compute power just isn't there. The resources you need to throw at it far outstrips the cost that you could possibly ever spend. So that leaves us in a very bad way, and it's brought us to a very bad place in time. Advanced persistent threat. So we have a situation now where we have professional adversaries who are well-funded, they are after a particular target, and the advent of client-side buffer overflows has made their jobs so much easier and brought them to a wonderful place. So there's a basic pattern, there's a basic life cycle to what they do. They penetrate deep into the network by popping boxes through the client-side attacks that I described. Now, it could be just social engineering, that works too. Probably works as well, if not better, because it's easier to trick someone than to spend months and months finding an O-day in Word. And just, either way they get in, then once they're inside that perimeter, because that desktop is deep in their environment, they have the run-of-the-mill, like I said. Antivirus can't stop them. We can't even deploy the network intrusion detection systems that will not detect them anyway, because it's just too big of a win and too expensive. So they move around, they scan the environment, they find the server-side buffer overflows that were left open because it's inside the network, so we can trust that it's not as at risk, right? Wrong. They do pass the hash attacks, they leverage to attack trust exploits. They just basically move around the environment at will, and it's very hard to detect them. And of course, at the end of the day, they have a purpose, so they're going to keep at it. Time is Not a problem for them. They can just keep shooting at it until they get what they want, because it's probably unlikely that the defenders are going to find them. However, they are at a final disadvantage, right? Up until now, all the advantages, all the bonuses have been on the attacker side. We can't find all the vulnerabilities. We can't detect the vulnerabilities when they find them, and they have control of that whole situation. However, once they're in our networks, the game has changed, because now we control the environment. We know the environment. They don't know it, and it's going to take them time. Now, if we're not able to see them on the inside, that time is not a problem. But if we can take advantage of the time that they have to burn in our environment, and they want to move slowly, right? Like I said, if it was a buffer overflow, an O-Day, it might have taken them months to figure out, O-Days can go on the market for $100,000, right? It's not cheap. It's high value. They often talk about using an O-Day will burn it. So once they get in, they want to protect that investment. They don't want to get caught. So they're going to move slowly, they're going to move cautiously, and every minute, every hour, every day, every week they spend in our environment, that's an opportunity we have to find them and to beat them and to flush them out. So it's an opportunity for us. And what's more, because there is a consistent common pattern to the way they do things, that's another opportunity to us. They have an SOP, a standard operating procedure, a means of doing things that is fairly repetitious. It's the same thing. You could probably find half a dozen talks at Black Hat, DEF CON, and the rest that talk about the APT methodology, and they're all pretty much the same. Probably half of them are given by Mandy, but either way. Next slide, please. Come on. Okay, bear with me here. Having a PC mode. Okay, so our defensive strategy dilemma. There we go. So our current defenses, it's like a gunfight. If you miss that first penetration, you're done. You have no more chances. That's it. Over. Game done. Sorry, you lost. Pack up. Go home. However, advanced persistent threat and the types of adversaries we see now from Clientside, we can't play a gunfight anymore. We have to play chess. We have to think in the long term. We have to get over the idea that we're never going to let them in the environment. We can't assume that they're going to get in the environment. We have to live in a world now. We have to accept the fact that we live in a world now that they are going to get in the environment. They're probably in the environment already. When I started in this business in '99, I was like, oh my God, they're going to get broken into. About 5 years ago, I was like, yeah, I just wondered who's in our network and how long have they been there. And that's really the mindset we need to get into. And it's not an easy mindset, especially for managers. But we have to convince them of that, because that's the way it is. They just have to come to terms with that. We're in a state of denial if we think anything else right now. Go back to that chart from Information is Beautiful. And at the end of the day, of course, the key thing with chess is you can't win in one move. You have to play at least 5 to 10 moves, maybe 20, maybe 30, depends on you and your opponent. So really, though, the problem is we don't have options to do that right now. All of our defensive technologies are built around that idea of stop them before they get in. We are now starting to see in the last few years technologies coming out from the vendor spaces that start to look at the idea of, okay, they're going to get in. We got to live with that fact. It's a hard sell because, again, nobody wants to own the idea that you're already compromised, but we have to get to that place. So we need to come up with some new ideas and some new means of defending in order to actually take advantage of those key differences once they're on the inside. We want to take advantage of the opportunity presented to us by the adversary being in our backyard that we know and they don't, and they have to move carefully. So, not done here. This is just a stop point to think about what we're going to do here. We need to stop depending upon halting attempts to breach the network. We just have to stop that. We've lost that game. It's done. It's over. What we do need to do is start playing a deeper game. Assume they're going to get in. Do everything we can to stop them. If we stop best practices on trying to prevent them from getting in, it's just going to get worse. So we can't stop what we're doing, but we need to refocus and put new resources in. They're getting in. They're already in. How do we deal with it? We need to stop looking for the malware itself. I don't know that I say uninstall your antivirus, because at the end of the day, if you do see something, you can get a signature for it, it will kill it. The problem is that it will probably be the old variant and the new variant gets deployed and it will be not terribly effective. But there's no solid alternative yet, so I wouldn't say rip it out. Same thing with intrusion detection on the network, which has a new role in this type of defense I'm going to talk about in a few. But at the end of the day, we need to look at the behavior. Right? We actually need to knuckle down now and deal with what is the bad guy doing in our network. look for what the bad guy, how the bad guy is behaving through his malware. We got to stop fighting that tool set. Looking for buffer overflows just doesn't work in Adobe, in browsers, in Office. We rather need to deal with defending against and engaging the adversary correctly. That's the game of chess. You don't play chess against the pieces on the board. You play a game of chess against that guy sitting across from you. Ultimately, they're people. They make mistakes. They do stupid things. You got to take advantage of that, and you got to be able to be in a position to take advantage of it. So how do we do it? So I'm going to talk about the kill chain. Yes, I'm going to talk about the kill chain. Get over it. Dislike cyber. We're going to eat our vegetables and use those terms. So the kill chain was developed by Lockheed Martin, published back in 2011, something like that. And this is their graphic, taken from their paper. And they have a very, their idea is very straightforward. The DoD had a mentality of find out what the attacker has to do in order to do you harm. What's their process? A, B, C, D, however many to you are now harmed. Find ways to stop their process at any and all points so that they can't get to that final step. If you break the process, you prevent them from getting to where they need to be. I love this. I think this is fantastic. They even go into some fantastic depth to say you have options. You could detect them. You could deny them access. You could disrupt what they're doing. You could degrade their capability. You could deceive them, which I really like, and we'll get into a bit more. You could destroy them. Now, that's probably not an option in the commercial space. Probably more an option for the government space, but that's neither here nor there. But at the end of the day, it is a useful means to determine, to deal with that behavior. We have to understand what their behavior is. We already kind of know how APT works, so if we apply a kill chain to it, that might help us out. Now, the problem I have with the Lockheed kill chain is, if you'll notice, it's very heavy on the getting popped step, right? So it goes from reconnaissance to weaponize it. Reconnaissance, find out what's going on in the victim environment. Weaponize a buffer overflow, that's all that research you have to do. Then deliver the payload to the adversary, to the victim. The exploitation happens, the box gets popped, the bad code runs. The bad guy then installs his malware into your environment. He has now command and control into your space, and he can do a bunch of stuff. This kill chain kind of waves its hands at actions on objectives, is how they phrase it. In my mind, that's where we need to live. That last step that was just kind of stop actions on objectives. Because as I said, we're not going to stop them on that first part. Maybe we can with some tricks. It's not going to be a consistent method. It's not going to get us wins all the time. So shortly after the kill chain came out from Lockheed in 2012, there was a Black Hat talk by a guy whose handle is Ford. He's been in the business a while too. And his talk was intrusion along the kill chain. He revamped the kill chain to take out the weaponization and to take out the installation parts, because that's completely in the adversary's control, not really in ours. And he basically said, you know what, I want to flip that coin and focus on what they do once they get in. So yeah, we do some recon, yeah, we do some attack delivery, and yeah, we do some client exploitation, but now, C2, command and control. Okay, now local compromise, maybe escalate privileges on the victim box. Now do internal reconnaissance to find out what else is living in our network. Now we go on to lateral movement. Move this through past the hatch, do the buffer overflow on the server side vulnerability on the server that's 5 routers down inside of our network. Then through that, the bad guy's going to compromise more boxes and more boxes and more boxes until he establishes persistence. Because at that point, if you find 3 of his 20 boxes that he owns, yay, I found the bad guy and I rooted him out, right? Except you missed the other 17. He's persistent in your environment. So this, in my opinion, is the kind of kill chain we need that allows us to focus on their behavior once they get in, because we're not going to stop them from getting in. Just not. And so MITRE, my company, has published what they call the attack framework, which is, I think, an outstanding way of looking at this in a bit more depth. I just started doing this, I'm fairly recent at MITRE, and I did a project that used this, based its work on this heavily, and I found it to be an outstanding method to put meat on the bones of that right side of the kill chain. So we're thinking of after the exploit, right of the kill chain, going left to right or down, if you will. And so the MITRE attack framework is a nice project they've had going on, where they look at different tactics and different techniques. The 9 different tactics they have, persistence, privilege escalation, credential access, these are all the things, the broad tactics that the adversary has to do in order to compromise your environment, move within your environment to do all the bad things. Of that, MITRE has enumerated 100 different techniques that are very specific. Pass the hash being one, the golden ticket being another, Windows admin shares. There are different methodologies that the adversary will use in order to implement those tactics. And this eye chart here, this is all publicly available on attack.miter.org. It's a nice little wiki you can go into wonderful depth to see the different ways that adversaries will use the Windows platform specifically. I need to stress that the attack framework is very Windows specific. It does not go into Linux, it does not go into network devices or anything like that. This is almost kind of a starter project. And they go into, well, but on the other hand, right, let's think about what our biggest attack surface is. Anyway, so they go into wonderful detail about all the different things an adversary will do in order to leverage their advantage on the inside of your network. So if we start using this framework and leverage it to build our defenses against what we know they do, because they keep doing this, again, APT is very consistent for the most part in the behaviors they've done because they work. They're not getting caught most of the time until mandating comes in once in a while. So just keep going. They don't want to spend any more resources than we do. So this is a nice way to start. So, excuse me. What we need to do is apply this to right of the exploit. We need to apply right of the exploit to our defenses. We need to change the way we're doing things. We need to change the tool sets that we're using. So, IDS and antivirus, I think I can say I've proven that they've seen their day, and we shouldn't, rely or invest on these. We should not increase our investment. I think we probably need to maintain them. I'm loath to say rip them out because they may serve some use in corner cases or in some circumstances, and we don't have a solid replacement for them. And intrusion detection on the network actually does have a role to play in right of exploit that I'll talk to, but like antivirus, it's kind of a corner case. It's not a magic silver bullet. No magic silver bullet really exists, but it does have some measurable role to play. But there are new defense types on the market that we can start looking at. There's threat intelligence, where we're sharing indicators of compromise or IOCs between partner organizations or like organizations. A lot of vendors are coming out with this. We have forensic technology that can look deep into the payload. There's some products that will do live packet capture and put it on hundreds of terabytes of disk in a rack-mounted server in your data center, so you can comb through it. That's great for some things that can be useful. Behavioral detection technologies, this is where it gets a little bit harder because you need to be able to understand your environment, what's normal, what's not. But at the same time, some of the adversarial behaviors like DNS fast flux do kind of stand out like a sore thumb if you look for them, if you have the right tools in order to find them. And then lastly, my personal favorite, but what's really difficult to implement, is that deceptive technology piece. I think there's a huge potential here, but there's also a lot of difficulty in getting them. And I'll go through all these in more detail in a couple of slides. So, having kind of gone through a brief view of what we could do on the right of kill chain, right of exploit side of the kill chain, we shouldn't necessarily neglect left of exploit, though I definitely think we don't want to spend a whole lot of time working on it. Try and keep them out as best we can, but until something seismic comes along to really shift things in our advantage again, I think we'd be much better off spending our resources in looking at what do we do once they've got in. Because until we can definitively close that door again, they're going to keep getting in. And we are just losing an opportunity if we don't focus on that. So with the sandboxes, this is the, you sniff on the packet stream and you find the you take a file and you run it in a VM, which is in the sandbox, and you see that the VM reacts to it in a bad way to show you that it was buffer overflow or malware or something like that. Endpoint app virtualization, you take your applications and you put them in a virtual container so that if the application suffers a buffer overflow, it can be contained and it won't affect the overlying system. It can shut it down maybe before the buffer overflow has a chance to execute the malicious code in the environment. And then lastly, application whitelisting. Right? This one has some more interesting possibility because we're now moving away from that blacklist. So we're saying these are the only things that are good. We're not going to accept anything else. And that's the kind of security we want. But, I think what I'm going to talk through real quick in a few slides is that there are operational issues with that, and it's going to be difficult to actually implement that, especially in, the brownfield environments where we've already been deployed. We've already got hundreds or thousands of Windows or Linux or whatever running. Go ahead and try and figure out what you are already running, what you need to run. That's the challenge there. So, we can take all these new technologies on the left and the right of the exploit on that kill chain, and we can map them back and see exactly where we cover. And if we look at, if we were able to deploy all these, in theory, we should get a lot of coverage on all the elements of the kill chain. That would be nice. Obviously, we can't deploy all of them. Certainly, we don't want to just deploy one of them. And of course, at the end of the day, we don't want to just buy products and throw them out there. A lot of security does come down to your processes It does come down to how you do things. So you want to bring in some new tools where appropriate, but you also want to look at making your whole operation a bit more security savvy, a bit more attuned to dealing with things that will help you find the adversary once they're in your environment. There we go. So, and of course, to that point, I always like to point out the issues with the technologies. There is no silver bullet, and don't believe the vendors when they tell you this will solve all your problems. Sandboxes, we have some definite problems with capacity, where sandboxes are ultimately trying to address that problem where intrusion detection failed, in that you have to apply a lot of computing power, right? That's why we're spinning up virtual machines with Adobe and the rest of it, hoping to see the buffer overflow execute or the malware execute in this sandbox thing, so that we can say, yes, this is bad. The problem becomes that you have so many files moving across, you can't run every file in that environment, so you still have to pick and choose. Most sandbox technologies will go through and say, I'm going to pick these because I think they might be bad, and I'm going to run them in the sandbox, and the rest I'll just hope and assume they're okay. There's also a problem with specificity, where you have to be running the vulnerable version. So how many versions of Adobe are in your environment? How many versions of Office? How many versions of Firefox? If you're not running the right one for the exploit that went down to the vulnerable system that happened to be running, Firefox 37 and everyone else is at 41, you're not going to see it. And then there's the problem of evasion, right? The whole arms race for over the 15 years that bad guys would take a buffer overflow and do evasions like we saw with the Adobe PDF and what have you, or the server-side evasions they've had for 15 years. Sandboxes are victim to the same problem. There's going to be there are known evasions where they can just encrypt it, they can try and detect whether or not they're in a sandbox, they can wait for an amount of time, because again, back to capacity, sandboxes have to give up after a certain amount of time and move on to the next file, because that stream of files never stops. So if the malware can be clever enough to wait long enough, it will just be missed by the sandbox entirely. The problems we have with endpoint detection is that sitting between that operating system and the application can cause serious impact. The new technologies that are coming out look very promising, but they are also can be very destructive. And programs that may not be written terribly well from the perspective of that virtualization sandbox might cause problems and blow up in a bad way, causing a business issue. The whitelisting, like I already kind of mentioned, you have operational issues. How do you know what's okay? There's a lot of files that get run, and the bigger your business is and the more complicated it is, the more you're going to have to deal with all the thousands of cases of programs that you need to identify are okay to put them on the whitelist. Threat intelligence, someone needs to have seen it. So it's great that we're to share, that's a very good defensive strategy, but somebody needs to be the first guy or girl to have seen it and say, okay, I got something, share it out. And then the other side of that is, once it's shared out, the more people know about the indicator of compromise, the greater the likelihood that the adversaries are going to see that they've been compromised, that the indicator of compromise is out there, oh wow, they can see me with this. If I change this knob, suddenly they can't see me with that indicator of compromise. Network forensics, fantastic if you know the question you want to ask. If you know the question, it'll tell you. The trick is knowing that question. And that's pretty much the hardest thing in our area of defense, right? What question do you want to ask? Behavioral detections. This can be particularly, if we know the adversary's behavior we want to detect, that's great. If we want to detect the deviations from our own environment, what's normal, what's okay, that's a lot harder. And it scales probably exponentially the size of your organization. I used to work at an organization that was hundreds of thousands of people large. This was a non-starter. In other environments, it's much more constrained. And if you have a very well-defined set of what's normal, deviations get easy. And this could be an easy win without buying a product. You want to look at things like logs and so forth. And lastly, deception. This is my personal favorite. It gives us the most options because they don't know the environment. They don't know what's good and what's bad and what's clean and what's different and what's unusual. You do. You and your organization should, on theory, know your own environment. So if you can put little canaries, little honeypots, honey tokens in your environment that the adversary has a good chance to trip into, then you can easily set yourself up for success where they just, again, they're following their nose, they're fumbling along. You don't want to make it too good to be true because they'll figure that out real fast. But it does have the better potential. However, that's going to be very difficult because on the one hand, you need to be kind of clandestine about it within your own organization. If you're emailing it and have standards published on your website about your deceptive technologies and they're reading your email and they're reading your websites, you kind of giving them the roadmap to defeat their own defenses. And at the end of the day, defenses can have their own operational impact where, okay, we set up these defenses and maybe our own people kind of trip into them and it causes problems and therefore, management gets upset and then we break them back out again. So it's tough, but if we can find the right balance, I still think it has the highest amount of opportunity, but it brings with it a lot of baggage. So other monitoring measures we can take, these are kind of more things we can do today. Monitor our outbound traffic, pay much more attention to what's leaving our network. Forget what's coming in. What is leaving? Where's it going? Is that okay? We can do this today with a lot of out-of-the-box open source tools. Look at our logs. Logs are a very neglected source of information about our own environment. Take that kill chain, take the attack framework, and learn what happens to my own systems when when this behavior happens. If pass the hash happens, is there something on the system that can tell me that pass the hash just happened? Don't focus on tools, rather develop methods and technologies to hunt for the adversary in your own backyard. So, learn the traffic patterns and behaviors and look for those outliers if you can. This may not scale to your environment. Also try and get help from your IT department. Your help desk may well be the first point of contact with you and the APT. That call from the guy who his box is acting weird, he just doesn't understand it, that could still be a tip off the way it's been for the last 20 years that something's wrong. There is definitely something going on here. And so lastly, we need to think strategically as defenders. We've got to stop worrying about the next exploit and the next vulnerability and the next thing to come out. We need to look at a large game. We need to stop looking for the silver bullet. We need to look at defense as a holistic. I'm going very pie in the sky here, but it's true. Our networks are our turf. Use that to our advantage. Home field. We want to leverage that. That's our best asset right now. And we need to that end to understand our own risk and exposure. Right? We need to understand where are we weakest, where are we most vulnerable. Are we vulnerable to pass the hash, or are we using Kerberos everywhere? It's an important question. Deploy those defensive tools, but also enhance your techniques in order to take advantage of that right side of the kill chain. You can't just deploy a box and get a right side of the kill chain win. You have to take it deeper. And most importantly, resources are limited, so we want to minimize the impact, maximize the impact of careful selection and placement. Dollars are hard to find as they've ever been, maybe even more so. So be very careful. If you know your environment, know where you might be the weakest, you can find the tool that will fit best in your place to give you the best win, and then backfill the rest of it with techniques and methodologies on your own side. And then lastly, you've got to develop an incident response process if you don't have it. If you catch the APT, it's like, okay, now what? It's like the dog that caught the car. What are you going to do now? So, do you want to flush them out immediately? Do you want to contact law enforcement? Do you want to let it linger for a while and learn from how they're behaving, and so on and so forth? So, in conclusion, old signature-based technologies are no longer effective. In the modern threat landscape, they are dead. And so, in order to have IDS live long, we must shift to the right side of that kill chain. We have to deal with that post-compromise. Get over the idea that you can keep them out. You're not going to get them out. That time is long over, if it ever existed. Those new defenses are needed that use detection techniques that cannot easily be evaded. And so, signatures will always be available easily. Sandboxes, I think, will be very well available for the most part. And we have to look at ways that it costs the attacker a lot in order to try and evade the method of detection that we put out there. Also strategies and tactics that we need to change our strategies and tactics to deal with that modern adversary. We need to change the way we do things. And we must be prepared to deal with them once we've detected them. Once you've detected them here on this one box, again, do they have one more box? Do they have 10 more boxes? Do they have 100 more boxes? If you root out the one and don't find the other 99, you've accomplished nothing. And that's it.